Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description. In today's podcast, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some information that we've already gone over. We've gone over E&Y's global report, but there's so much information in there that I wanted to go back and cover it in more detail. And I wanted to go over some of E&Y's key metrics, and I wanted to do a little series on this as long as I don't get distracted with other news stories. But I wanted to break this up into several parts since it would be pretty long to cover in one podcast episode. But I wanted to help people understand E&Y's business and help people with their chances of getting a job at E&Y, or if they already work at E&Y, then help them understand some of the metrics, because when you work in the Big Four accounting firms, you don't really look at the global reports too much. It just doesn't matter as much in the day-to-day, but if you want to move up in leadership in the Big Four, then you need to know these global metrics and the things that leadership cares about, because that's just part of being political, is part of knowing what leadership wants to hear and repeating that to the people around you, but also the clients, because they just want you bringing this up to the clients. And one of the big things I am noticing with the Big Four is their involvement in social justice topics and metrics. And one of the key things that we've learned from COVID is the globalization and outsourcing of the reliance on scientific data or metrics to organizations like the UN or World Health Organization. There's no local or personal responsibility for metrics or anything like that. It's all outsourced to these almighty global organizations. And the more and more I learn, the more and more I look into Big Four information, the more I'm noticing it's rising up as more than I ever noticed before. And especially in light of COVID, where the UN and the World Health Organization are becoming more important, I'm sort of interested in that it's coming up in the Big Four more and more. And I've noticed it with the Big Four with their adoption of ESG standards and other metrics. And E&Y has a ton of this type of stuff in their global reports. And the more you learn about this, the more impressive you'll sound in your job interview or when you engage in recruiting, or like when you're working on the job at E&Y, because as E&Y, and one of the reasons it's like this is because I think this is just part of being a global firm now. In order to operate on the global stage and to get into certain countries, you have to buy into these global organizations, but also the Big Four do work for the UN and World Health Organization. So the more they use their data, the more likely they're to get work from them and the doors that the UN and World Health Organization and other organizations can open. So E&Y in their global report mentions the UN and the World Economic Forum. And they're using these two international agencies to come up with initiatives and metrics. And E&Y mentions a coalition for inclusive capitalism that they joined in 2017. And this is a global coalition with multiple companies. It's tons of companies that are in this. And they joined this coalition to show how they perform in 4 value dimensions. Number 1 is human and people value. Number 2 is consumer and client value. And number 3 is social value. And number 4 is financial value. And because of this coalition, E&Y built a long-term value framework along the same lines, or at least that's what they said, and it looks kind of like they just copy and pasted. And so they've built a similar framework, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But they also said that they contributed with the World Economic Forum to establish a key set of metrics to standardize disclosures around ESG and long-term value creation. And once again, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So In other words, they helped establish metrics that will make the most money for them in fee revenue, or at least that's my perspective. Because the big four aren't really going to come up with a bunch of metrics that are super easy and that clients can do easily by themselves. They're going to come up with metrics that are a little bit hard to determine and where you need a consultant to hire and audit so that the big four can come in and make the most money. And it wasn't just E&Y doing this with the World Economic Forum. Obviously, the other big four accounting firms would have been involved as well, but it's very interesting in how these ESG standards came about and are being pushed very heavily by the big four accounting firms, because there's plenty of money to make off of auditing these standards if you mandate they go in annual reports around the globe. But it also makes E&Y's job a little bit easier if they're standardized around the globe. And E&Y speaks about how they measure themselves along these dimensions, but also, get this, how they measure up against the UN Global Compact's 10 principles and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as you see here, once again, they're referring to the UN and the World Economic Forum. And so that they're saying how they're tied in with all these global agencies, but then they sort of cut it down. And you should read those separately. UN Global Compacts, 10 principles, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we'll probably cover those later, but E&Y then boils down to how they're going to measure their impact. And this is where it gets a little bit simpler, and it goes along with how they've reported data in the past. And they measure their impact through number 1, people, number 2, clients, number 3, society, and number 4, revenue and growth. And we're going to be covering each one of those in future podcasts. So make sure to subscribe to this podcast to get the rest of this series, and support us financially through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes to this if you can, to help us keep putting out more content and cover more Big Four information. And also, if you can't do that, then just go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video on YouTube. Thanks for listening.